Ladies and gentlemen, our program will begin in just a moment. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to AJC at the Conventions 2020, AJC's virtual advocacy program on the sidelines of the Democratic and Republican National Conventions. We are delighted to be joined today by Senator Ben Cardin from Maryland, ranking member of the Senate Subcommittee on Western Hemisphere, Transnational Crime, Civilian Security, Democracy, Human Rights, and Global Women's Issues, Representative Gregory Meeks from New York, member of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs and co-chair of the European Union Caucus, and Representative Mikey Sherrill from New Jersey, member of the House Committee on Armed Services and retired lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy. Each of our guests are friends and great partners to AJC in Maryland, New York, Long Island, and New Jersey. Our esteemed guests, in a conversation with Julie Raymond, AJC Deputy Director of Policy and Diplomatic Affairs, will explore how America's approach to international affairs has changed in recent years, the forces that shape U.S. foreign policy, the rising competition for global influence, and what we can expect for the next 4 years. After we hear from Julie and our panelists, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org, questions is plural, or use the Q&A chat feature in Zoom. Please be advised that AJC is a nonpartisan 501c3 nonprofit organization. As such, AJC does not endorse or oppose political parties or candidates. And as a reminder, AJC will be hosting identical panels on the sidelines of both the Democratic and Republican National Conventions. Julie, you and our guests have the floor.
Thank you so much, Jillian. It is my great privilege to moderate this most esteemed panel about an issue that is at the core of AJC's worldview. We believe that we must work to ensure the strong leadership of the United States in global affairs is the best protection for our nation's interest, the preservation and promulgation of democratic values and human dignity, and the security of our closest allies. During the course of our programming this week, we've had a chance to delve particularly into issues related to Israel and Iran. We will touch on these vital points as well today, but to start, I'd like to ask the panelists to broaden the scope. We know that the United States can't be the world's policeman. History has shown us that when the US withdraws or is perceived to retreat from global stage, dangerous vacuums are created, and others, whether they be state or non-state actors, will rush to fill them, pursuing goals that might be antithetical to our own. AJC meets with diplomats and foreign leaders daily. We get regular status reports from them about how they see the US role in the world. As someone who's been in the thick of it for decades, having led the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and other bodies, Senator Cardin, I want to start with you. From your perspective, what's the state of US leadership in the world stage?
Well, first, Julie, it's so good to be with you, and it's great to be here with my colleagues, Representative Meeks and Sherrill. I got to say something about Greg Meeks, because the two of us served together in the House of Representatives, and I've worked with him on so many international issues. It's good to see him. It's good to see both of you, and it's really good to be here today. You've asked, Julie, I think, the critical question, and I want to say about AJC, we admire the work that you do. Each of us work across party line on issues that are critically important to Israel and the Jewish community, and we want to make sure that we maintain that strong bipartisan support for the special relationship between Israel and the United States. I must tell you, it's a real pleasure to be part of the Democratic National Convention here on this issue and the issue that you mentioned, because quite frankly, I think this is a unique convention, not just because it's virtual, but because we are really nominating two people to save our democracy and to restore America's global leadership. AJC has it right when you say that you want strong and principled U.S. global leadership, that it's critical to the security of our nation. I couldn't agree with you more. And that global leadership has really been challenged by President Trump. We've seen over and over again that what he's done to our traditional friends with the transatlantic partnership. You've seen what the president has done in weakening U.S. leadership on issues such as climate change or the World Health Organization, or on trade policies where he's isolated America. The list goes on and on and on where America's been isolated. But the real key point is that America's strength is in our values. Our special relationship with Israel is because we share common values and we work together on those common values. President Trump has weakened that strength of America by what he has done in regards to democratic principles. So that void has been filled by other countries that are not our friends. And we've seen that the president has embraced authoritarian leaders rather than democratic leaders. So for all those reasons, that has weakened America's global influence, which is not good for the national security of the United States and for our allies, such as Israel. Couldn't be prouder to support Joe Biden. He understands foreign policy. He's credible on the international front. He will restore America's global leadership by practicing the democratic values here in America and to reach out to establish those on an international front. And my colleague, Kamala Harris, who I work with in the United States Senate, we have a great team that understands America's strength is in our values, that we need to work on the global stage, and that's important for America's security, and it's important for our relationship with Israel.
Very, very good. Thank you. Congresswoman Cheryl, you came into Congress during the Trump administration. And even though this is a Democratic panel and we're talking about what the Biden administration's policies would look like, I'd like to ask you if you've seen efforts undertaken by the Trump administration that shouldn't be dismissed, whether it's moving the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, or the statue towards NATO, or Iran sanctions, or something else. Are there policies that should stay should Vice President Biden win in November?
Well, I think what we've seen during this administration is addressing some issues that have long been issues in foreign policy. So our relationship with China, whether or not we should still be in what some of us call these forever wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and taking on sometimes these tough issues that we need to be talking about, and I think we need to be rethinking. The problem has been, unfortunately, something that you learn, and I was so glad to see Senator Cardin, because I spent a lot of time in Maryland at the Naval Academy. I still have family down there. But one of the first things you learn at the Naval Academy as we're training our youth for professional service in our military is the military is really your diplomatic tool of last resort. You really need to have a strong State Department. That is where we determine how we are going to promote our values and hopefully not enter into conflict or war. Hopefully, because of our alliances across the world, we can utilize those alliances to bring the force of democracy and really beat down those other forces in the world that are contrary to, I think, human dignity. And so what we've seen with the president is, even though there are areas that we need to continue to address, and I'm glad he's brought them into the conversation, unfortunately, the real hard work of diplomacy has not been done. We've left our allies out. So I think when you look at where we are with respect to Iran and trying to reinforce embargoes, we've had a go-it-alone approach, and that simply hasn't been working on the world scene. We are strongest when we are acting in concert with other democracies, and every month, every year that we kind of give up on those alliances, we are losing ground. And when we lose ground because we're promoting the values that Israel so believes in, Israel's losing ground as well.
Thank you so much, and I'm glad you mentioned the urgent need and the importance of diplomacy in the State Department. Congressman Meeks, I want to turn to you. Knowing that it's just 1% of the federal budget, the money that we invest in international affairs, funding the State Department, funding USAID, AJC sees that as a strategic investment to advance America's interests throughout the world. But in recent years, there have been repeated threats to cut these resources, to try to reallocate them somewhere else. Can you speak to that issue and sort of what you would expect from the next 4 years?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Julie. Let me also say thank you to Senator Cardin and to Congresswoman Cheryl. Senator Cardin has long been a leader on foreign policy when he was in the House and when he went over to the other side, which is the Senate. He he continues to lead, and someone that I look up to and follow what he does, because we've worked on a lot of issues together. And you can just see the kind of talent that we now have on the House, particularly when it comes to foreign affairs and on the armed services, when you look at Congresswoman Cheryl. And I think that when we have that expertise that's now as members of the House and we start talking, you talk about in the future and working with a Biden administration, not just based upon theory, but based upon their actual life experience, it's going to make a difference in the policies that we move forward. If we look at the Trump administration, most of the individuals there that had experience, they've all ran out, they're gone. You started with General Mattis, and you're talking about the 1%. The quote that he is most familiarly known with is, less money for diplomacy equals more bullets, which is more expensive. So the investment on diplomacy and working together with our allies is extremely important to not only our, with foreign affairs, but even domestically, because it makes us safer. There is a reason why after World War II, we started many of these multilateral and international organizations, because it makes us safer and it makes a better world. And what this administration has done with all of those international organizations that were put in place that helps America is pull out and isolate ourselves. So when you talk about, for example, a WTO, if you talk about a WHO or the OSCE or NATO, they're there for specific reasons, and it sets a rules-based system that we can all cooperate in, which then raises the standards for around the world and can address those that don't want to play by those rules and isolate them, as opposed to us isolating ourselves. And that's why we've got to invest money, and we've got to educate the American public. Because too often, when you go and talk to the American public and you talk about the percentage, that 1% that you talked about, Julie, in foreign affairs, they think that we spend 20, 25, 30% of our resources on foreign affairs. And if you look at the per capita amount of that we put in with that 1%, it's smaller than some other nations. So we've got to go about and educate our constituencies on the importance of diplomacy and foreign aid, and how it does in fact benefit that small amount of money, that small amount of resource that we put in, how it does make us safer at home and benefits the American people. We saw pre-World War II what happened. And that's the reason why we established these organizations, so that would never happen again. And so we need to invest more because we get a better return on that investment by doing so.
Thank you so much. Talking about investments, Israel is one of the United States' best allies, strongest friends, and a significant recipient of that investment, of both aid and military assistance. Senator Cardin, I want to ask you, when several of your colleagues tried to link U.S. assistance to Israel based on annexation, or really if they wanted to base it on any sort of change in policy or action by the Israeli government, you came out really firmly against that. Where does this stand in the Senate? And is it something that continues to be a concern to you?
There is strong bipartisan support in the United States Senate, in the House of Representatives. Historically, we've had the strong bipartisan support for that special relationship between the United States and Israel. We have legislation that's been authored by my colleagues, Senator Coons and Senator Rubio, the Israel Security Assistance Authorization Act, that makes it clear that we're going to continue to be a partner with Israel because it's important in the U.S. National security interests. So I have no concerns about the security assistance and moving forward with Iron Dome and all the other, David Sling and all the other, O3, all the other security issues that we have between the United States and Israel. We're going to have differences with Israel's government decisions. I have differences with the United States government decisions under President Trump. That's a healthy discussion among democratic states. But when it comes to the fundamental protection of that special relationship, it's strong and will remain strong. And I could tell you, as a leader in the Democratic Party, I'm not going to make it a wedge issue. I have my differences with President Trump. I've already expressed some as it relates to the way he conducts foreign policy, which I think is not in the America's national security interest and not in Israel's national security interest. So I'm going to express that, but I'm not going to make it a wedge issue. I'm going to raise concerns about the president giving oxygen to nationalism here in America, which is very dangerous for all of us. I applaud AJC's statement about white nationalism as being the most deadly and dangerous threat to the United States. I couldn't agree more. But we saw with President Trump giving oxygen to the rise of white nationalism in the United States in Charlottesville, which has led to additional activities in America, which has been dangerous in the rise of anti-Semitism. So I'm going to express myself on those issues. But when it comes to the core protection of that special relationship, I can tell you I was proud to see our Democratic platform in this convention strong on that relationship, and that relationship is solid.
Thank you so much. Congresswoman Cheryl, is this conversation about the possibility of conditioning aid playing out in the Armed Services Committee at all? Are you having that discussion there?
So yeah, thank you so much. And that was so kind of Representative Meeks, who's, you know, in New Jersey, we sometimes hate to give compliments to people across the river in New York. But it's been great to have the partnership between Foreign Affairs and the House Services Committee, which is so critical. And I thought his words about, you know, quoting General Mattis were just so well put on many of our concerns. In the House Armed Services Committee, probably because many of us have served in the Middle East, it is a very, you know, support for Israel is a very bipartisan support. So we have, you know, the U.S.-Israel Cooperation Enhancement and Regional Security Act. It passed the House on July 23rd of last year. That authorizes security assistance, joint research, cooperation on security projects, and it authorizes the president to transfer defense articles to Israel in response to an imminent security threat. We've introduced and passed HR 3186, the U.S.-Israel Indirect Fire Protection Act. I led that with Representative Joe Wilson, also of the House Armed Services Committee, a Republican from South Carolina. That authorized the Secretary of the Army to produce 2 Iron Dome batteries. That is just, you know, that just speaks to the critical partnership that the United States and Israel has. As we looked in the United States to develop Iron Dome batteries, we realized that the technology in Israel actually, you know, why reinvent the wheel when they had that technology, and we had such good defense industry partnerships. So that was Raytheon on the U.S. side that had helped with much of developing Israel's Iron Dome system. So that's what, you know, so we went forward with that purchase with that good partnership. And then and you know, we voted it out of the committee. It was a fully bipartisan vote. You know, nobody voted against the National Defense Authorization Act out of committee. And then we also supported the defense appropriations package that allocated $3.3 billion for Israel and $500 million for joint missile defense. And this annual appropriation, it's been included. It was included without substantive opposition. So in the House Armed Services Committee, I think, again, because of the deep understanding of our partnership with Israel, the critical partnership we have with them overseas, it is a very bipartisan, there is a lot of bipartisan support for that relationship.
Thank you so much. And not to belabor the point, but I want to give Congressman Meeks the chance to answer this too, because I know it's been a subject of considerable discussion in the House Foreign Affairs Committee as well.
Yeah, no, I think Senator Cardin had it just about right. There's no question, for example, on the MOU that was agreed upon under the Obama administration, that is absolute, 100% solid as a rock. And I don't think anyone can talk about tampering with that and Israel's right to defend itself. And nobody wants to cut and limit Israel having the opportunity to defend itself. I personally have gone to Israel. I've seen some of the tunnels that was dug, for example. I've been there when the alarms have gone off. People have to take cover. And so we know the extreme importance in the region to make sure that Israel has the right to defend itself, and the dollars that we give Israel to defend itself is absolute and unequivocal. And where I say that the senator had it right, of course, there are disputes in regards to policy, in regards to some of the things that President Trump has done, and some of the things and some of the issues that Prime Minister Netanyahu's done. And so we have the ability to talk about that in that regard and want to have a clear message, I know on my part, that I believe that there needs to be, and there has to be, ultimately a two-state solution. And we've got to make sure that that is on the table and not do anything that will destroy the possibility of a two-state solution. So I think there's some messaging that goes on within the committee, but that's the bottom line of it, is saying that we must have a two-state solution so that we can have an ultimate peace in the area. And I just got to add, I think that a tremendous step in the right direction just happened with the agreement with the UAE and them acknowledging Israel and working with some of all the Gulf states. I hope that it begins to continue. And now Israel has made the agreement not to do, at least to move forward with the annexation. That's working together, and then we can get the other countries in the region. So now we have Egypt, Jordan, and the UAE, and we get some others to join them. We may be moving in the right direction. That it's huge what's happening. And I think everybody has to agree upon that. You look around the world, not only the United States, but if you look at our EU partners, they all were for it. The whole world looked at that move as a big positive step in the right direction. And so I'm hopeful that happens, but we understand that Israel's right to defend itself, our strong ally, in a bipartisan way, we stand strong in that regards.
Thank you so much. And I hope you could hear from New York the cheers of AJC when that deal was announced, because I think you're right. I think it could really be a watershed moment and change the game. It's sort of impossible to talk about Israel and not talk about Iran. Even as we're celebrating the good, positive steps, threats remain. So, Senator Cardin, your views on Iran track almost exactly with AJC's. You opposed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, yet disagreed with President Trump's decision to pull out of the deal. International coordination regarding Iran does not seem to be getting easier. A U.S. draft resolution calling for the extension of the arms embargo in the UN Security Council failed miserably, supported by just 2 members, opposed by 2, with 11 simply abstaining. And Iran has rejected the idea of resuming negotiations with the United States until sanctions are lifted. How do you think the U.S. should be moving forward at this point from Iran? So hopefully we could get news, good news on this front. And what might we expect from a Biden administration?
Well, Julie, first of all, thanks for that question. Iran's a dangerous country. It's being led by dangerous leaders. It's not just their nuclear program that we're concerned about, their ballistic missile program, their support of terrorism, their violations of basic human rights. We stand with the Iranian people, and that's why we speak out against the Iranian government as being one that is out of step with international norms. The Iran nuclear agreement was an effort to bring its nuclear program into under control. And you're correct. While I disagreed with the agreement, I was pleased to see an international effort to try to isolate Iran's nuclear activities. I was disappointed they allowed nuclear enrichment, and I thought we needed to deal with the other issues that were not included in the nuclear agreement, including their support for terrorism. What President Trump did in removing the United States from that agreement unilaterally was to isolate America rather than isolate Iran. And the vote in the United Nations Security Council was extremely disappointing, but it was not surprising to see how the United States has been isolated rather than Iran. We needed to work with our European allies particularly, and we have strong alliances with Europe in regards to isolating Iran. And if we would have worked with the UK, if we would have worked with France, if we would have worked with Germany, we could have isolated Iran and we could have gotten the extension of the ballistic missile ban within the Security Council, but instead we've isolated America. So what Joe Biden will do, he understands diplomacy. He understands, he knows all these world leaders. He was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, vice president of the United States. He is known for his foreign policy expertise. He will work with our traditional allies to form an alliance and then go to the countries that we have challenges with. No question that China and Russia are going to be difficult to deal with, but they don't want to see a nuclear Iran. That's why they joined with us in the JCPOA. That's why we can get them to join with us in the United Nations to isolate Iran. But you got to work with our allies rather than isolate America. That's what I think you will see. I mean, as he'll restore American values globally, our traditional alliances, and then work with those countries we need to have strategic relations with, China and Russia, to isolate dangerous countries such as Iran. He'll do it effectively, whereas President Trump has been a disaster in regards to working to isolate these type of countries.
Staying in the Middle East and talking about trying to sort of build coalitions around the issues that are important, Congresswoman Cheryl, this week the UN-backed Special Tribunal for Lebanon found one member of Hezbollah guilty of the assassination of Lebanese Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri from 2005. The tribunal exonerated the leadership of Hezbollah in Syria, saying that there wasn't enough evidence, but I think it's clear to everyone who's watching that the conviction of a Hezbollah member directly implicates this Iranian terror proxy. Using global influence, if we're still in a position to do so, what can we do to convince other nations and multinationals like the EU about the threat that Hezbollah poses and the urgent need to designate them as a terrorist organization?
I think that's a great point. And I just want to say, because I'm going to unfortunately have to go after this, I had a previously scheduled engagement. I'm so glad that AJC had me today. It was such an honor to be on with Senator Cardin and Representative Meeks. So thank you again for letting me take part in this conversation. You know, we know that Hezbollah is deeply embedded in Lebanon. It won its first majority in the Lebanese parliament. It's clear that they're a terrorist group, they're an Iranian proxy. It's deeply entangled in the Lebanese political culture. That's why it's so important that the United States accept to bolster legitimate organizations in Lebanon so they can stand up to Hezbollah and resist the political influence that they have. And I think building on what Senator Cardin said is we, you know, through this administration have continue to act in ways that isolate the United States in the region when we should be isolating other groups in the region like Iran, because Iran's influence, I think when we talk about why Iran is such a bad actor regionally, you know, it's not just that they're a bad actor as a state, they're a bad actor throughout the region. They're creating and destabilizing region as a whole, and are backing groups like Hezbollah, threatening Israel. So this is why it's so critical that we have our allies throughout the region. And I think it was striking to many of us to see the reaction when the Saudi oil field was bombed, and the United States reacted and other allies questioned our intelligence in the region. I think knowing full well that our intelligence was correct, they simply didn't want to stand with the United States. They didn't trust our leadership in the region. That was really striking to me, and I think that's again why we need the leadership of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, just to focus on that region. Joe Biden, as you've heard, knows the leaders. He can reassert our relationships, and I think provide the type of stable leadership that our allies are really thirsting for and will trust. So I think it's critical that we move forward in that way. But again, it's always a pleasure. AJC is such a wonderful organization. We have a lot of participants from my district in New Jersey, and I really appreciate you having me today. Thank you.
It's been our pleasure, and thank you for adding your unique perspective as both a member of the Armed Services Committee and as a lieutenant in the Navy. Thank you for your service then and now, and we'll look forward to the next conversation.
I'm glad you said that, because I meant to correct the record. I left the Navy as a lieutenant. It was a nice promotion you gave me. Thank you so much.
So you can actually thank Michael Bloomberg, because we use the Bloomberg service for a lot of our data.
Okay.
So if you want, I won't correct them.
No, I'll reach out. I try to put out, I try not to put out fake news.
Don't we all?
Thank you again.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Congressman Meeks, I want to pivot a little bit. We've talked a little bit about Europe and the threats that are posed really to all of us. You've been outspoken about Russian meddling in elections and have really criticized the way the United States has handled Russia. What should our policy be right now, and what tangible steps can we be taking now? I know we have a little background noise. I hope you could hear me.
I hear you.
Okay.
So yes, look, I believe in engaging and talking with our allies and those that we don't agree with. So, I think what the Biden administration will do, will he talk to Vladimir Putin? Absolutely. But will he just acknowledge and say he's my good friend or take his word over our intelligence agencies? No, he will challenge him. He will stand up and tell him that it will not be tolerated with him tampering into our elections or our allies and our partners' elections, that we will not allow them to play around with our democracy. He will be straightforward. That's what diplomacy is all about also, especially when you're talking to strong-armed individuals. When you're talking to Russia, it's not, and Putin, they're not individuals. We see what's taking place today with the #1 opposition person being poisoned. That's not the first time that has happened. So you can't come in and say, this is my best friend, and I love him like he's done with Kim Jong-un. You've got to address the human rights violations that they have. You got to address the criminal elements that they have within their administration, and you got to do it to their face. And that's what the Biden administration and Joe Biden, when he was the head of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Senate, has done. That's what I know that I've done. I've had talks with some of them in Sudan. I've talked to individuals in right now Belarus. So we talk to them, but you tell them straight what the deal is, and you work with our allies in a multilateral way, and don't give them any room to move around. And I think that's how you would handle Russia, and try to get them. And that's why we talked about, and I mentioned earlier about a rules-based society. That's important for us. So you tell Russia, you tell China, you tell anyone else. If you don't play by these rules, then you're isolated. You're out. If you want to play with the rest of us, you play by these rules. That's why it's important to have these international organizations, multilateral organizations that are working with our allies, and that's how you deal with Russia. Deal with Russia the way we've done thus far. Our allies don't know, they can't trust what we do. They don't know which way, whether we're going to support them or not. When Russia, if we're not standing up to them about meddling in our own elections, but what's going to happen when we see that they're meddling in our European allies' elections? They're going to think that we're going to stand with them and our NATO allies, elections. So that's how I think you approach Russia. You approach them straight on, and anybody that has a strong arm, a leader like that, straight on, straight up, not mincing any words with them, and letting them know what the rules of the game is.
Thank you. We keep talking about the multinational, multilateral institutions. And Senator Cardin, I want to ask you, because you've been deeply involved for so long in these types of bodies, currently serving as a special envoy for combating anti-Semitism and racism for the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. In this role, you have a really unique perspective into what the United States does or doesn't do to persuade other countries to act on anti-Semitism. How much are we leading? And can you also speak to certain measures that we could urge other governments to adopt that would help Jewish communities around the world?
Well, thank you, Julie. I think Representative Meeks has it exactly right about engaging other countries. But we always need to engage other countries based upon our values. We never compromise what we believe in, but we have engagement with all countries. That's what the OSCE process, Helsinki process, is all about. It was established in 1975. The Helsinki principles, I think, are well understood on human rights, good governance, and those types of issues. but it also gives each country that's a member of the OSCE, including the United States and Russia, the right to challenge the conduct of any other country after meeting those obligations. And it's clear to all of us that Russia has not met those obligations. When our intelligence community tells us that Mr. Putin's government is offering bounties to terrorists to kill American soldiers in Afghanistan and allied soldiers in Afghanistan, that is something that must be brought up by the President of the United States in any conversation with the President of Russia. And yet, President Trump did not do that. He does not represent the values of our country in these relationships. So yes, we need to have a strategic discussions with Russia and with China and with other countries we disagree with, but it's got to be within the boundaries of our values and our principles. And that's what this administration has not done. So yes, I am proud of our participation in the OSCE. I'm proud of our participation in all these international organizations. We speak truth to power. We talk about these issues. As the special representative on anti-Semitism, racism, and intolerance, I have gone to Europe and spoken about the rise of nationalism. I was just recently, not too long ago, in Hungary and talked about the rise of nationalism in Hungary. But unfortunately, we see the rise of nationalism here in the United States. And it's important that the United States lead by example. One of the things I've done within the Helsinki process is raise challenges in our own country. We violate the principles of Helsinki when we deny the people of the District of Columbia full representation in our parliament. I raise those issues because we are not a perfect nation, but we are moving towards that type of goal, as was brought out at our convention last night so eloquently by our speakers. So we lead by example, and we engage based upon those principles. And when we do that, we're very effective. And when we work with our traditional allies, we're more effective. And President Trump has not only jeopardized American values by his example here in America and giving oxygen to nationalism and to hate, and to what he's done in regards to the way he characterizes vulnerable people, vulnerable communities, what he's done in regards to immigrants in this country, and the list goes on and on and on. But he's also weakened America's influence globally by not working with our traditional partners in these international organizations. So that's why I am very, very strongly supporting President nominee, Vice President Biden and Senator Harris. We need to restore America's global leadership by what we do here in America, recognizing our faults, but always sticking to our values, working with our traditional allies, and engaging the global community.
Thank you so much. It's, it's always so funny for AJC in these moments when we're alongside a convention, because as you both know very well, generally all of our conversations are bipartisan and nonpartisan. So it's an interesting experience, I think, both for our speakers, but certainly for our viewers, to be able to hear these sort of ringing endorsements. And of course, next week when we're alongside the RNC, it's going to look really different. I have one other question before we turn it over to the audience. I feel like we've sort of crossed the world in terms of the threats that are posed to the United States and to our allies, with one exception, and that's talking about China. So I really want to ask both of you sort of the perspective on China, and particularly as this coronavirus pandemic continues to wreak havoc across the world, causing instability and destroying economies. And a lot of our military experts are saying that we're going to see a rise in terror as a result, and possibility of failed states and things like that. Are we doing enough as a nation, globally, not necessarily in terms of our domestic response, but what are we doing globally? And is all of this continuing to shift power, and is it doing so in a way that might actually benefit China? Congressman Meeks, I'll start with you.
Ray, you're on mute.
You're on mute.
Unmute.
Okay. First of all, what I think that has happened as a result of this, what we have found is we've allowed and created the cracks for China to go around and to deal with it. First thing that we do, you know, when you're talking about the pandemic, for example, what do? We pull out of the WHO. We don't work with anyone else. We isolate ourselves. We should be talking about the way that we stopped and Vice President Biden, along with President Obama, the Ebola scenario. He brought people in all these nations together so that we could fight it and move in a collective way, and it prevented Ebola from coming over to these shores and some other places. So that's how the world is much smaller than what it used to be when we see these pandemics, et cetera. And the only way that you can get a resolution is doing it collectively together, because it affects us. You know, I say, you know, it used to be a world where you could isolate yourself. When it took place in one part of the world, didn't affect the other part. That's no longer true. That's what this pandemic shows immediately. And that's why you have to work very closely. Now, I, for one, in dealing with China also, and again, I guess there's a theme here when you hear me talking about multilateral relationships, et cetera. I looked at, for example, the proposed TPP. Not, you know, a lot of folks think about it as a just, you know, domestically, et cetera. I looked at it as a diplomatic way and a solution to resolving and isolating China. And we had individual countries that were a part of that, some from the same region as China, some from Europe, some from South America, because now we're setting something up around the world so that China has to play by those rules. And as a result of us pulling out and the others staying in, China now has the wherewithal in the room to run around that same world and do their own individual trade agreements and establish relationships with some of these other countries simply because we are not there and we have not worked collectively with them. And that gives them the wherewithal to do that. That is why we've learned early on, and I stress, pre-World War II, when countries were doing things on an individual basis, those that were the fascists of the world or the dictators of the world, they were able to advance. And so we said the way to stop that, and guess what? For over the last 70 years, we've been very successful in working together to try to make sure that those that don't want to play by the rules are isolated and we're not isolating ourselves. And so that same model, I think, should be utilized with China today. That's why I was a supporter of TPP, you know, understanding that we didn't explain it. And I would hope that under the Biden administration, when we look at agreements like that, and I think it would be important for the Foreign Affairs Committee, because, you know, sometimes you think it's not within the jurisdiction of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and it just maybe a ways and means, but no, it's a diplomatic tool that can be utilized to isolate a country to make sure that they play by the rules. And if they don't, it's not just unilaterally, they're going to suffer because of the multilateral countries that are working together and say we all going to play by the same rules.
Julie, if I can,
right there with you on TPP. Sorry, Senator, go ahead.
Julie, if I could just, I think reminding us that AJC has been a strong nonpartisan supporter of the U.S.-Israel relations, and the fact that on the basic issues affecting U.S.-Israel relations, we all worked to create and maintain the bipartisan support for Israel. So if you want to talk about the letter that Senator Portman and I authored in regards to the ICC and its treatment of Israel, or you want to deal with BDS, and the two of us have worked across party lines to get those things done, or the Security Alliance and support for the appropriations, it's been very, very bipartisan. On foreign policy, we're always stronger when we act in unity. And I thought one of the telling moments of the Trump administration was in its very first year, when I authored legislation with the late Senator McCain in regards to the U.S. relationship with Russia and taking on President Trump's behavior with Mr. Putin. That bill passed 98-1 on the floor of the United States Senate, showing strong bipartisan support for Congress to disagree with President Trump in the manner in which he was dealing with Russia after the interference in our elections. But in regards to China, there is strong bipartisan support to stand up to what China is trying to do today. They are trying to change the rules of engagement on economy to deal with an authoritarian government-controlled economic rules rather than the democratic type rules that we have on international trade. We're standing up to that, Democrats and Republicans together. China has changed its policies recently to be more engaged globally against US interests, and we need to stand up. My disagreement with President Trump is that he, again, is not working with our traditional allies to isolate China rather than he's isolated America, particularly on trade policy. He's isolated America rather than working with our traditional allies to isolate China till we had a stronger position going into these negotiations. But make no mistake about it, we recognize that China is a threat to our national security. And we know that we need to take on China. And we're doing that in a bipartisan way in the United States Senate.
That's heartening. Thank you so much. Jillian, do we have questions from the audience?
Thank you, Julie. Yes, we have a lot of questions coming in, including from Noah Stern on Zoom and Jen Rosenthal in Seattle on strengthening US diplomacy. She asks, earlier Representative Sherrill spoke about alliances and the importance of diplomacy as a key to building relations between the US and other nations abroad. What steps should we be taking now to increase these diplomatic efforts? And why is our current system not working? Senator Cardin, can we start with you?
Well, take a look at President Trump's budget and the way that he would cut our State Department budget by about 1/3. And look what he's done to politicize the State Department, which has great career people who work for the United States in diplomacy. Look what he's done in compromising diplomatic ways to deal with our challenges rather than the type of diplomacy that he practices, which is more of a self-interest than it is dealing with the global partnerships and values that make America the great nation it is. So it really has been a combination of so many factors that this administration has done to weaken diplomacy. And you know, quite frankly, I think Representative Sherrill said this, that our military should be our matter of last resort. They're our last diplomats. Our frontline diplomats are our State Department, or the people at AID, our economic assistants, what we do to deal with poverty, working within the United Nations on the Sustainable Development Goals to eliminate world poverty and to deal with healthcare and to deal with gender issues. This is how you prevent the need for the use of our military, working to end modern day slavery with trafficking, dealing with anti-corruption, democracy building, those types of programs, which have been strongly supported by the Obama administration, only to be weakened by the Trump administration in the budgets that they have submitted to Congress. So I think you'll see with Biden-Harris a revigoration of career diplomats and support for diplomats and the budget support we need to promote democracy and to promote humanitarian and economic development globally, which will help us deal with a safer world.
Thank you. The next question comes from Jack Levy in Detroit, and this is for Congressman Meeks. He says, you're a leader in the House Foreign Affairs Committee on many issues, including on US relations in South America. How would you say the US has handled issues plaguing the Western Hemisphere in recent years, including the crisis in Venezuela and transnational migration?
We've been absent. I mean, we virtually have pulled out of the rest of the world, including our own hemisphere, where we should have a large focus. So when you look at what's taking place in Venezuela and how we dealing with it, I mean, just to say we're going to just sanction and that's the only thing that we're doing, we're not working with, say, other organizations like the Lima Group or the OAS to not look at, you know, as Vice President Biden was doing with reference to prosperity initiative in the Northern Triangle when we're dealing with Central America, whether it's the Honduras and El Salvador and Guatemala. When you look at what's taking place in the human rights violations and others in South America with regards to Brazil, what has the president done? The president has, he has embraced its president who is an individual, I guess, who's similar to him. Maybe that's why he's embraced him, who has violation of human rights. The economy's in the tank. the pandemic is running wild in those areas because they seem to be similar. So he has abandoned what our principles and that we've had in the Western Hemisphere. To strengthen the Western Hemisphere, we should be working collectively, I think, with Colombia and with Peru and with Argentina and Chile. And that's how we're going to ultimately get, because what we need to do in Venezuela, for example, we need to find a way for the opposition to unify and to get a path to have elections there. That's what's going to happen. That's what's needed. Otherwise, you see the migration of individuals leaving Venezuela, going into these other countries. And so they have as much of a vested interest in resolving that issue as anyone else. And that's why we've got to work very closely with them. So I see a complete abandonment by this administration over the last 3 years of any significant relationship and moving forward in Central South America. I mean, to even set and change some of the historic rules that we've had, say, even with the OAS, where we've always had, not with the US, with the IDB, where we've always had a person from the South America being the chair of the IDB. And now he wants to switch that and says it only has to be someone from America, as opposed to America working collectively with the IDB so he can do the kind of economic development that is necessary to help rise up the countries and to begin to continue, as was taking place under the Obama-Biden administration, to reduce poverty. One of the biggest reductions of poverty took place in the 8 years of Biden and Obama. And Biden had as part of his workload, his assignment, the president talked about that last night, of dealing with Central America and eradicating poverty. And I think that's what you're going to see happening under a Biden-Harris administration moving forward, and understand the significance of making sure that we take care of our partners who share this hemisphere in Central and South America.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Ari Fish in New York City, who says, although the anti-Israel voices in Congress on the Democratic side is confined to just a few members, polling suggests that Israel faces severe criticism from a significant portion of the progressive wing of the party. You meet with advocates all the time. How can we more convincingly make the case for Israel in progressive circles? Senator Cardin. And then,
well, yeah, there's clearly different views, and we recognize that. But where I think within the progressive element of the Democratic Party, the major reason why it supports the relationship between the United States and Israel is they recognize that Israel is the only democratic country in that part of the world. It's a country that has a robust democracy. It has a country that has accountability through an independent judiciary. When you look at why democratic institutions are so important to protect human rights, it's because you have an independent judiciary. You have people being held accountable for abusing power. You have the commitment to allow people to disagree, to dissent, to be able to speak out without fear of being imprisoned. You have the ability through the election process to elect your leaders through free and fair elections. That's what a democracy is all about. That's what America stands for. That's what Israel stands for. And Israel is the only country in that region that stands for those democratic principles. Israel lives in a very dangerous part of the world. That's another thing that requires us to reach out to explain the pressure that Israel deals with. And that's why it is so valuable to get as many members of Congress as possible over to see the region itself, to see the security issues that Israel faces directly by seeing the geography of the country and recognizing what Israel goes through every day. Once you do that, you pick up more and more friends. And we do have very, very, very strong support within the Democratic caucus for that special relationship, as Congressman Meeks has talked about several times, and we've all talked about. So I don't want to overreact to some of the comments that you may hear from individual members, but I do think we need to reach out and be very aggressive in pointing out why that special relationship exists between the United States and Israel. Why in 1948, Harry Truman, against the advice of his own State Department, recognized the state of Israel and established that special relationship. And to understand the security risks that Israel confronts every day and needs to make sure its first responsibility is to keep its citizens safe.
Thank you. Congressman Meeks, anything you want to add?
Well, I think that the senator has it exactly right. I think that one of the most important things, I know for me, I learned more about the scenario by traveling to Israel. I know more about the circumstances that Israel faces by going and seeing it for myself. It's hard to just, imagine it and just to talk about it, but going there, you go there and you go to a restaurant and you see how people have to sit in back and everybody's basically making sure their backs are to the wall so they can see who's coming in the front of the door. And then also thinking about where they may have to take cover because they're scared of someone coming in to bomb the place. You go and you see and you walk under the tunnels that have been dug with individuals trying to infiltrate and kill individuals in Israel. It changes your perspective. You go and you go to, for example, at a time, unfortunately, when I was there, and you hear the alarms going off and how people have to start going to duck for cover, it gives you a different perspective. And you go and you just talk to ordinary citizens of Israel, and you find that they just simply want peace and want to be able to live alongside their neighbors, which is why I am a strong proponent of getting the two sides, the Palestinians and the Israelis, back together at a bargaining table and figuring out how we get a two-state solution and be able to work, and as opposed to having military conflict with one another, talk about how you can help support one another, whether it's food and agriculture and technology and trading and ideas and education. Those are the kinds of things that we need to get to. And when you do that, I think we get to a better region. And that's why I re-emphasize the significance of the UAE agreement and getting others on board with that, because that's how you make a change and have not just a cold peace, but a warm peace. People ask me at times, because I, think that you've got to have good trade agreements, but I say that there are two old forms of relationship between countries. One is war. The other is when you get to the point to become interdependent and you're trading technology and ideas and agriculture. I like the latter better. And that's where we need to go. And I think that, so the conversations and different ideas, we've got to make sure that we speak up and speak out in that regards. And I think that's significantly important. So I urge members to travel anytime they get the opportunity to the region, because that changes your mind and gives you a better understanding of what's taking place, I think.
To the region and to all the regions, right?
To all of that's exactly that's what I'm talking about, to all of the regions.
Thank you for leaving us on that high note with that optimism. I have to say, I always learn so much from talking to both of you and to Congresswoman Cheryl, of course. And this conversation really panned the globe in a thoughtful, forward-looking way and gave us great insight into the foreign policy priorities of the Democratic Party. For all of our viewers, I hope you'll join us again next week, same time, same place, to have a similar conversation with Republican leaders alongside the RNC. And with that, Jillian, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you all for such a fascinating and important conversation. I'd also like to thank our audience for joining us today. To register for upcoming AJC at the Conventions programming, please visit ajc.org/conventions. Again, thank you and goodbye.